Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our virtual International Council this year. We're very fortunate to have the Managing Director with us today to share her thoughts on rebuilding the global economy and the future multilateral system post-pandemic. I won't keep her waiting long, so just a few quick notes on the technical aspects and the logistics for today. We'll reserve a little bit of time at the end for audience questions. If you do have a question, I ask that you please type them into the questions pane of the control panel. I'll collect those throughout and then I'll read a few out loud at the end. You can join our live Twitter conversation today by using the hashtags and Twitter handles on screen. And I also want to thank our International Council sponsor this year, Morgan Stanley, for making this program possible. So let me quickly introduce our moderator today. We have with us Mr. John Lipsky, who is currently at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and most recently was the former first deputy managing director of the IMF. And nobody knows the fund better than John, so I am delighted that he's here to moderate this discussion today. As many of you may know, John is also a member of our executive committee and has been hard at work over the last several months assembling our new board of directors and global advisory council and shaping the new strategic direction of the committee. So thank you so much, John, for all of your hard work and dedication. So without further ado, I will turn it over to you, John, to give the managing director a proper introduction.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you all for all the work you're doing to revitalize and push forward the Bretton Woods Committee. It's a pleasure and an honor today to welcome the Managing Director, Kristalina Georgieva, to the Bretton Woods Committee's International Council. Thanks, Managing Director, for taking time on this, which is, I think, as busy a day in the year that exists for a Managing Director. Now, the Managing Director really needs no introduction to this audience, as the IMF has been front and center in dealing with a historic crisis that, frankly, no one anticipated when she took office just 1 year ago today. Well, it was actually October 1st last year. Still, I'm guessing that it may not be widely recognized how unique the Managing Director's background has been for this position. If there's a subtext here, that she's been a trailblazer for a long time. She has a PhD in economics, and you know that diversity in this field remains a challenge even today. But she has also the most prior experience working within multilateral institutions of any managing director. You may not be aware she's been at the World Bank from 1993 to 2010, dealing with environmental issues and sustainability issues. This is not a new topic for the managing director. Then, of course, in 2010, 2016, she was at the European Commission as a commissioner and dealing with, among other things, humanitarian aid, a very relevant issue in recent days. And then back at the World Bank from 2017 to 2019 as CEO of the IBRD and the IDA. So it's no surprise that despite the crisis, she was able to hit the ground running as managing director. And it's a lucky thing for the world and for the fund and for all of us that she has been. As we all know, the Bretton Woods Committee is committed to supporting and promoting a multilateral rules-based system with the goal of strong, sustainable, balanced, and inclusive growth, and all that those goals imply. At our members meeting yesterday, we introduced our new board and advisory council, and we're ready to get to work. And what better way to start than to hear directly from the managing director? And following, there'll be a session with David Malpass. Well, what a week, Managing Director. Welcome. You've released the World Economic Outlook, the Fiscal Monitor, the Global Financial Stability Report, and at the crack of dawn this morning, I think even before sunrise, was the G20 ministerial meeting. What a week. So after what a period of challenge, what are the key conclusions that you'd like to offer about the outlook that we can take away from recent developments and from the fund's latest analysis?
John, thank you very much for the invitation to join. My most sincere thanks to the Bretton Woods Committee for the work you do. I am convinced that we need the Bretton Woods spirit today more than ever. And in fact, I can give you a preview of my annual meeting speech, and it is about a new Bretton Woods moment. Why? Not very difficult to grasp. The worst crisis since the Great Depression, and on top of it, a combination of crises. In one, we have a health crisis, we have an economic crisis that has been driven by the pandemic, but we also have sparks of a debt crisis in some countries, and I will come to that point. It has been a year like no other, and I'm convinced that we have also an opportunity like no other to inject transformation on a scale that can fix some of the problems from before the pandemic and make them more resilient for the crisis and shocks to come. So what are my big takeaways from the work my fabulous team that you know very well has done in preparation for these meetings, and from all the discussions that have taken place so far, especially in the G20 context? One, we are indeed in a dire place this year with projections for global growth minus 4.4%. But it is less dire than we anticipated only a couple of months ago. And the reason it is less dire is twofold, and it is very important to integrate these reasons. First, because of the immense synchronized policy action taken everywhere, but especially in systemically important economies, among them in advanced economies and China. The injection of liquidity that came out from $12 trillion fiscal stimulus and from the $7.5 trillion of monetary policy injection by accommodative policies taken by central banks. This has put a floor under the world economy, and it was so noticeable how between March and April, markets not only calmed down, they opened up, and emerging market economies can borrow at reasonable cost. Not only advanced economies, but emerging markets with good fundamentals can secure financial resources to sustain their economies. Two, we learned how to live with the pandemic still around us. Do not underestimate the significance of micro measures that we all take as individuals, that we take as institutions. The fund moved to work from home on March 13th. In one day, we switched from majority of people coming every day to the office to almost nobody coming to the office, while the volume of work has gone up. And that incredible acceleration of digital work, it is a reflection of how much we actually have done. We didn't even know we can do it. We can. So this is my first message to everybody, that we need to give the world credit for the innovation that underpins our ability to function, to have this seminar today, and for the policy actions that have brought the economy back on its feet. My second takeaway is we cannot underestimate how uneven, partial, and uncertain this recovery is, until such time we have a durable exit from the health crisis everywhere. So if you ask me what is our top priority for the next months, for the next years, make sure we have vaccines, make sure they are accessible everywhere. This is a very knowledgeable audience, so you would immediately appreciate an upside of our base scenario because of accelerated delivery of vaccines. In the baseline scenario, vaccines appear sometime in 21. but they become universally available by the end of 22. We accelerate this, and we can have up to $9 trillion additional output by between now and 2025. This is very significant. So focus on health systems, make sure that we are collaborating on vaccines and we make them available everywhere. As long as they are not available, as long as the pandemic is traveling around the world, we don't have a durable recovery. Message number 3, and this is the one that, to be honest, I'm sharing with greatest heaviness in my heart. We are faced potentially with the tale of two cities. Parts of the economy and parts of us doing really well, not even well, we are doing better. Parts of the economy, parts of the population doing very, very badly. Some countries exiting the crisis fast, other countries falling behind, and a renewed divergence between advanced economies and emerging economies. Just to give you one illustration of this problem, we have Africa this year growing 3%, sorry, shrinking 3%, a little less than the world as a whole, but next year growing 3%, which is less than the world. First, for Africa to be in minus territory with the population growth that in many countries is quite high, this means more poverty in many countries. But not to, Africa has to grow 5, 6, 7, 8% faster than the rest of the world. So we have, and this is where institutions like the Fund and the World Bank are so important. We do need to make sure that this tale of two cities doesn't happen, neither within countries by zeroing on the most vulnerable parts of the economy and most vulnerable people, nor globally within countries. So let me stop with these 3 messages. And on the G20, just say great news. If you have seen the communique, it says extension of the debt service suspension initiative and common framework for bilateral creditors to work together on debt issues. I'm so pleased that David Malpass and I have been lobbying for that. Very pleased to see it. We want it more, but this is a step in exactly in the right direction.
Absolutely. But I suspect that the audience is quite familiar with the DSSI and that the G20 ministerial has now endorsed another 6-month extension with the possibility of another 6 months extension if needed. But perhaps you could say a few words about the framework, because I suspect not everyone is familiar or recognize how important this could potentially be.
Yes, and actually, I do want to talk about that. I mentioned it in my in the answer to the previous question. So first, a step back. Where are we on debt? Debt levels are going up everywhere because to sustain the functioning of the economy, governments are borrowing. Luckily, interest rates are very low, down to 0, in some places even negative, so affordable. On average, the world is going to go up to 100% to GDP debt level, and our fiscal monitor predicts it would stabilize at that level. Okay, what do we know about averages? You put your head in the refrigerator, you put your feet in the oven, your temperature is average, but you're dead. So advanced economies, debt in advanced economies is going to go up to 125% of GDP next year. Emerging markets, 60–70% of GDP. Poor countries, 50% of GDP. And you may say, so that's not so bad for poor countries. Well, it's very bad, because the guys that go 125%, they have a much, much better borrowing capacity. The poor countries, 50% of them stepped into this crisis already in trouble, or actually more than 40%, now they're 50% in that distress. So, and that goes straight to the question of the debt service suspension initiative. If you step into a shock, putting your economy to a standstill, you are a tourism dependent country, your revenues drop to 10% of their previous level. You are a oil exporter, you're in trouble. And if you have to service your debt, you virtually have to make choices between saving lives and paying your creditors. Plus, your economy would be destroyed. So in April, David Malpass and I raised our voices that for poor countries, there has to be suspension of debt services. As long as the economy is in standstill or in a very tough place, countries should be eased. Their service should be delayed for later, for when they get out of this situation. And we really wanted private sector to be part of this solution. What happened? Bilateral creditors agreed. The G20 embraced it. Great. There was and continues to be a call to private sector participation. Not so great. They're not really venturing keen. Partially because countries are not asking, they're afraid they ask, they're frozen out of markets, and they worked hard for market access. Partially because the private sector is not so keen. They don't have common framework, they don't have common principles. So we do have something valuable. But the official side is improving with the common framework. We still have to bring private sector participation. And for the fund, John, as you would immediately understand, this means stepping up our work on improving the international debt architecture for private sector participation in debt restructuring.
Mm-hmm. That's obviously going to be a very important aspect of the post-pandemic recovery, and facilitating the course for the emerging developing economies. In broad terms, of course, the world looks to the fund not just for analysis, but also for advice on policies. What broad policy advice is the fund providing its advanced economy members and its developing and emerging economy members?
From the very beginning of this crisis, we have invented a new surveillance tool. We call it the Action Tracker. We track 193 countries, what steps they're taking. Very important for us to absorb this learning, very important for countries to learn from each other. And of course, we stepped up our analysis of the parameters of this crisis. It's a crisis like no other, demand and supply. We are putting on purpose the economy in standstill. What we came up was not necessarily what people expect from the fund. The very first thing that came from the fund was spend. I don't think there are many managing directors that would go around and say, please spend more. Keep the receipts, be accountable for what you spend, but please spend. In other words, we very early gave that message, and I think it helped countries to do the right thing, to provide lifelines to businesses and to households. And when you look at how this differentiates, advanced economies are providing 8 to 10% of GDP in fiscal direct and indirect measures, and kind of up to another 8% in monetary support. So it's a massive injection of support. Whereas emerging markets are somewhere around 6% total direct and indirect measures and a couple of percentage monetary. Poor countries, 2 to 3%. Big difference. And yet, sometimes poor countries are even in a tougher spot because they have economies dependent on sectors that are destroyed. And therefore, our advice there is don't wait. If you have high debt, it needs to be restructured. The sooner, the better. And don't hesitate to come to the fund for financial lifeline. And we have done 81 financial arrangements. Of those, 76 emergency financing, $101 billion in 6 months. This, of course, we will have to continue. Next phase would be more of the kind of more traditional, if you wish, fund programs, but we still have to adjust them to the new reality. So our first policy advice to the membership is put a floor. Do not allow massive bankruptcies and massive structural unemployment to hit you. Secondly, we say now we continue to recommend accommodative monetary policy. If you have a fiscal space, use it. If your fiscal space is tight, of course you're more constrained, but interest rates are low, take advantage of it. Our second policy advice, and of course prioritize health. I spoke about that in the previous segment. The second very important advice we tell them is, okay, you're going to use stimulus. What are you going to use the stimulus for? The first round of the crisis, it is really just supporting. I mean, you don't target anything. Now we need to target much better, and we need to target, in our conviction, building a more resilient economy for the future. Investing in infrastructure, in advanced economies infrastructure maintenance. 1% investment would generate 2% of basically growth. And these are job-rich investments, because obviously we need to find jobs for the people who have lost them. Think about your other crisis, the climate crisis. Direct your policy and your financing to increase your resilience to this crisis, to bring down carbon emissions. And then we are very concerned about inequality, because our research shows that after a pandemic, inequality goes up and stays there. So what we want is to see more attention to progressive taxation. There are parts of the economy that are doing great. I'm not sure they're paying their fair share. And actually, one of the discussions at the G20 was taxation and how we make sure that the part of the economy that is benefiting from the crisis is contributing more. What does it mean for taxation of individuals if the income differentiation is expanding even further? And then comes the quality of spending. It is unbelievable, but true. In developing countries, 53% of money spent in public projects is not spent effectively and efficiently. So you improve by 10%, you get a stimulus. And so that is an area you would see us working more. Governance issues. what is the crisis telling us? If you are a sound country, sound fundamentals, good governance, transparency, good public spending, strong buffers, you're better off. Why are we going to not do what is necessary to be better off for the next crisis? So you're going to see the fund being really demanding on this side, not on austerity. You're not going to see us saying, oh, tighten up, chop, chop, but you would see us insisting on transparency, on good governance, on quality of expenditures.
Sounds sensible. The G20 ministerial this morning, how did you gauge the receptivity of to the fund message? Are you getting through?
On the importance of helping weaker economies, the receptivity is really high. And I want to give credit to all our members. We got the 1 trillion lending capacity secured, new arrangements to borrow, bilateral arrangements secured. We asked for tripling our concessional lending capacity. We got it. We actually asked for, in April, for $17.5 billion concessional resources. We got $22 billion. And we are asking for more, so we need more. On that, a very good receptivity. We also got money to provide grants. We got grant money for our poor members not to have to service their obligations to the fund during the crisis. So genuine debt relief. This is not postponement. It is cancellation. When it comes down to the direction for the world economy, the policy advice, full receptivity, sustain the support, target it better in the next stage of the crisis. In many countries, digital and green come as top priorities, and we want to see that indeed happening. A lot of support for taxation, for fair taxation, for getting the loopholes in taxation, this problem addressed. There is more work to be done, though. There is still not a full political commitment to move on putting a kind of a floor on taxation, so you don't compete with cutting further down tax. There is agreement on how to tax the tech side of the economy. There is still work to be done.
Thanks very much for that. In a minute, we're going to turn to our membership to see if they've sent in some questions. So final question for me. It sounds, if you listen to the high level political discourse around here these days, you don't hear much devotion to maintaining and strengthening the multilateral rules-based system. But it seems like at a working level, at the ministerial level, things seem much more productive. How do you see the system and the fund's role in the system? Do you have enough resources, new facilities needed? Where do you see things heading?
I believe that this crisis has given space for what has been built over decades to play its part. And the fact that we have synchronized response by central banks and finance authorities, this is not by chance. It is the outcome of building that multilateral system. And it is indeed true that in our universe, which is finance ministers and central banks, there is a lot of pragmatism and collaboration, and things get done. Within the fund, the shareholders have been very constructive, and as I said, we asked for resources, we got resources. So I believe that globally, what we are seeing is scientists collaborating, pharmaceutical industry collaborating. The sense of this little virus demonstrated that we are interdependent. That comes true very clearly. As we go forward, I think, at least now I speak as the head of the IMF, what do I do day in, day out? Keep the membership together. Focus on what unites us, and then get it done. And then expand that unity on the basis of rational and well-argued case. And I think we all have to recognize that it is a new Bretton Woods moment, but only if we seize it. And I'll tell you, John, I hear many pundits going, oh, it's horrible, it's terrible, never been so bad. You look yourself in the mirror and you ask yourself a very simple question. What have I done so it is different? And as long as we concentrate on somebody else, we're not doing our job. What can I do? We will have our retreats next week, staff management, and we would have one very simple theme. I shared it with you before we started, and it is put our money where our mouth is. We have a job to do, get it done.
Exactly. Well said. I'm going to invite Emily Slater, our executive director, to step in and see if we have some additional questions from our members. Emily?
Thank you, John, and thank you to the managing director for sharing some of your priorities and some of the key messages out of the reports this week. As John said, it's been a very busy week, so we appreciate you taking the time. We do have some questions from the audience, and we have a few minutes here. And I just want to remind the audience that we do have President David Malpass coming on directly after the managing director, so please stay on the line for that. Don't go anywhere. A couple of questions here, and I'll kind of try to group these in a couple of buckets. So we've had a couple different questions on emerging markets. We talked a little bit about the extension of the DSSI. As noted, the DSSI doesn't include any relief for emerging markets. So can you talk a little bit more about, what the fund is doing to support emerging markets that might be in debt distress?
Mm-hmm. So the story is very interesting if you follow it from the first weeks of the crisis until now. In the first weeks of the crisis, I lost sleep when markets closed down and when flight to safety was demonstrably a big hit on emerging markets. But then once there was this pouring of liquidity and the Fed expanded swap lines, other central banks did similar things, the situation changed dramatically. We now have emerging markets with good fundamentals, raising money. Sometimes I even worry, maybe too much, too cheap, but they have no problem to raise money. So right now, this issue of debt for emerging markets applies to a small number, relatively small number of countries that have had either pre-existing conditions that we were with very high debt levels, or are very particularly hit by this crisis. Ecuador is an example. They had the pre-existing condition plus oil exporter, prices of oil collapsing, plus being hit by the pandemic more severely than other countries. So what happened in Ecuador is the right thing, debt restructuring. They did a good job in restructuring their private debt. They came to the fund. We were in a program discussion. Now they have a program. Argentina is a similar case, unsustainable debt, restructuring. Currently, we are in negotiations for a program. So for these countries, the fund is available to provide significant financial resources. As I said, we have 1 trillion. We have used 280 billion. We have 720 billion to go. I don't want to go with all of it. I want to be clear. I'm just saying we have space. Now, if financial conditions tighten up, if the corporate sector, where there is also very high debt level, cannot easily borrow, then we are in a different universe. And this is the uncertainty when we say there is a downward scenario. If we are stuck in this virus traveling around the world, spikes here and there for a long time, then this question of helping emerging markets with their debt levels would become a different animal. It would be something that obviously we have to think about early. But for now, this risk is minimal, and we do expect to see vaccine changing the equation for the better.
Yeah, I think we're all encouraged to see that some of the dire projections in March and April haven't quite borne out. There's a few more questions here. Let's talk a little bit more about the fiscal consolidation that you talked about, and then the need for governments to really make some difficult choices. They're going to need to spend more, but they're also raising less money. They're bringing in less money in terms of taxes. You talked a little bit about that, but what role could technology play in this, both on the spending side and on the tax collection side?
Huge. We already see countries that have embraced the digital revolution, rich and poor, faring much better in the current environment. Take, for example, delivery of targeted support to households. Countries that have moved their systems to a transparent platform, digital platform, they have been able to step up the provision of this support in a targeted and accountable manner. So governments can move to be e-governments. We know this is possible. There are countries that have done it. And then what you raise as revenues and what you spend is there for everybody to see. Transparency is the citizen's best friend. And I am a big believer that we should push for digitalization massively. For Africa, as far as I recall, it would cost 80 billion to make the physical infrastructure available for every citizen, every business, every government organization to be connected to the internet. 80 billion these days, when we talk about the trillion here and the trillion there, it obviously makes a total sense as an investment, and it would tremendously improve tax policy. It would improve spending practices.
Excellent.
Thanks. I think we probably have time for one more question. So let's talk about climate. You have been very vocal on this topic, and you have said that to ensure that the economy is more sustainable and more resilient post-pandemic, we must focus on climate and investing in a climate smart infrastructure and making the transition. How do what is the fund doing in this regard? And also, how do you respond to people who say this is outside of the fund's mandate?
Okay, so let's start with the mandate. I love this question.
Yeah.
Climate is macro critical. It is macro critical because if we do not take action globally, we are going to see temperatures going up and up and up, destroying our lives and our livelihoods everywhere. and maybe some places better off, some places worse off. But the economic consequences of climate change are dramatic, they're macro critical. How can we possibly ignore climate change if growth and well-being of people, their health, depends on whether we get in front of this crisis on time for it not to roll over us? Two, so that is about the mandate. We are about growth and employment, right? And financial stability. There cannot be financial stability if we don't have environmental and social sustainability. If the capital moves out of high carbon intensity industries, as we see that happening already, and your economy is all invested in that, what is a IMF economist going to advise the country? Close down? If you are a Pacific island, I'm thinking of the Marshall Islands. This is a country that is at risk of being washed away. So what is my advice to the country? Migrating to Australia? Is this the macro advice we would give? So I feel very strongly that the case for climate being a macro critical issue is made. So what is the fund doing about it? First, we, and this is where fund economists are fantastic, we put together a logical framework as to how to approach the climate issue, and it has three parts. One, use the fiscal stimulus to invest in green infrastructure, renewables that are good for dealing with climate, reducing intensity, good for jobs, job-rich sectors. Two, put a price on carbon, create a market incentive to reduce carbon intensity, and give forward guidance to businesses and consumers as to how this price is going to go up over time. And three, use some of your carbon revenues to help the people and the sectors that need to adjust, that are negatively impacted by climate action. Miners, people working in the coal, electricity production. This has to be a just transition. It has to be fair to everybody. So this is our framework. And then three, we are now taking this down to the level of countries. We are more advanced on climate risk for countries that are vulnerable to climate change already. And next, we want to concentrate on the big emitters, help them to charter a more sustainable economic policy path.
Thank you, Managing Director. John, we're running out of time here. So any final thoughts from you?
Well, yes, for me, but let's see. Managing Director, any final message you'd like to leave us?
Stand by us.
Yes.
Amplify the voice of reason, which is in a moment of transformation. The Bretton Woods institutions are your best friend. We are created for this moment.
Indeed. So allow me first to thank you very much for sharing your valuable time on this busiest of all days. Secondly, to thank you for the wonderful leadership that you've shown so far and that I'm sure you're going to continue to show. To wish you the very best, you and your colleagues, the very best of luck on future success and support, and to let you know that the Bretton Woods Committee looks forward to engagement, but also to support and promote a multilateral fair system with the Bretton Woods institutions as one of the centerpieces. Thank you so very, very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you to you both. Thank you. I'm gonna ask our audience to stay with us as we transition now to our next session. We're going to get President Malpass and our moderator Bill Rhodes on the line here. So just bear with us for one moment while we pull them up. And it looks like we do have President Malpass with us. Hi, welcome, President Malpass. Okay. Let's see, we can't quite hear you. Let's see if we can get your microphone here.
Okay, how's that?
There we go.
Hi, Emily. I was listening with great interest to Kristalina and to John.
It was a fascinating conversation. I'm glad that you could join us. Let me just try to get Bill Rhodes up here on the line, and then we can get started.
Okay.
Let's see, Bill, are you
Hi,
there?
Emily.
Hi, Bill. I can hear you, but I can't see you. Can you press your webcam button?
How's that?
All right. I have both of you. Welcome. Well, let's get going here. So thank you again, President Malpass, for joining us today. As with the managing director, you both are incredibly busy this week, and we very much appreciate you taking the time to join the committee and chat with us today. So just a few quick reminders before we get going. We will have some time at the end for audience questions again, so please send those in. Please type them into the questions pane of the webinar toolbar, and I'll collect those and read those aloud at the end. So let me now just briefly introduce our moderator, Bill Rhodes. Bill is currently president and CEO of William R. Rhodes Global Advisors and was former chairman and CEO of Citibank, where he spent most of his career. As many of you know, Bill was instrumental in the Latin American debt crisis of the 80s and 90s, so I can think of no one better to lead this discussion with President Malpass on debt and development. And as many of you may know as well, Bill has been a longtime committee member and is now on our executive committee and has been, really critical along with John and Bill Dudley and leading this revitalization of the Bretton Woods Committee and assembling the new leadership team. So Bill, your energy is endless, and I thank you so much for your dedication to the committee. So that's all from me. I'll turn it over to you to introduce President Malpass and get us started here.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you for all you do. For me, it is a special honor to introduce my friend David Malpass, who assumed the role as president of the World Bank last year. David gave a great talk at our 75th compendium outlining the challenges he faced. He has a long record of public service as well as being very active in the private sector and served in a number of positions in the Treasury and on Capitol Hill. In the environment of slowing economic growth worldwide and the effect of COVID-19, questions arise on the approaches and priorities of the World Bank going forward. Personally, I believe this is the most challenging global crisis that the World Bank has faced since its founding at Bretton Woods in 1944. And we are very fortunate to have someone as talented and as experienced as David leading the World Bank at this time. In the 1980s and 90s, we saw the Latin American, Asian, and Russian debt crisis and major debt forgiveness programs for the world's poorer nations. Today, when we look at Venezuela, Argentina, Ecuador, and many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, we also are facing, again, acute sovereign debt challenges. But we also have to consider the role of China, which is now a major creditor nation in its One Belt, One Road lending program. And this is especially true with their lending to sub-Saharan Africa and a number of other developing countries. And I think there's been a cause for concern, which David and I have discussed before, about the whole area of transparency with regard to this lending. And so before we open it up to questions, I have to go back again and say I think we are very fortunate with all his experience to have David leaving and the challenge that the World Bank and the world faces today. We've agreed on a couple of the questions and hopefully we'll have time, David, to get through all of the questions that we've agreed on with your staff. Introductory one, I think, is The COVID-19 pandemic has disproportionately impacted the poor. What has the World Bank done to prevent developmental backsliding and protect the most vulnerable in society worldwide?
Hi, Bill. It's very nice to see you. And people don't know how long we go back to the severe Latin debt crisis of the 1980s. So as we look at where we are today, it's worse than that. It's broader, for one, more developing countries hit than even in the 1980s. And by some of our estimates, we think the breadth of the downturn is the widest since the 1870s. And so that gives you a sense of the severity. We just put out new poverty numbers showing that extreme poverty will go up by 150 million people in 2021. To put that in context, there's been a rapid fall in extreme poverty over the last really 20 years. And so that's interrupted and made much worse by this crisis. And the inequality of it is stark. The advanced economies have both fiscal and monetary techniques. They're buying huge amounts of assets through the central banks, which puts a floor on asset prices, and also the major fiscal deficit programs. Neither of those is really available to most of the developing world, and so they're facing the crisis without those. What the World Bank has done, and thank you for asking, as soon as the pandemic hit, I told people what I wanted was fast action that would be broad. We needed to get to a lot of countries in order to be able to respond to this. So we put in place what is now 111 programs. It was very fast. In April and May, people working from home were able to get actual documented programs with, by the end of May, 100 countries, and we're now at 111, which makes it possible for them to buy COVID emergency response. I'm very pleased to report that yesterday our board approved by unanimous approval the expansion of that program, the fast track program, to vaccines, the purchase of vaccines, and also the distribution of vaccines and of treatments for COVID. So it's up to $12 billion of financing. And so that's one aspect of what we're doing, and the other aspect is to have a surge in World Bank activity that in order to meet and provide resources for countries around the world. One notable thing about the World Bank is the amount that is grant resources. It's as much as $16 billion will be grant. So if we put that in context, there really isn't any other source of grant resources around the world that's anywhere close to those amounts. That's made possible by the donations, the cash input from the donor countries. So we're today and over the next couple of weeks going to the IDA deputies to point out that by mobilizing this much of the financing envelope right now, this year, it means that there either will be a cliff, meaning a decline in IDA resources for the poorest countries next year and the following, or we need to look at a supplemental for IDA. We're proposing a $25 billion supplemental, of which $10 billion would come in the form of contributions by the donor countries. So I encourage the Bretton Woods committee to consider that and to think about the ways that new resources can be used. The World Bank has been an effective user of resources, and given the severity of the crisis, that's something that we should look at. And then, Bill, I wanted to step back for 1 minute, if I may. the reason that the bank is able to be effective in this crisis, or one reason, is when I started at the bank, we made some significant changes in the way it operates in order to focus more on good country outcomes. That was very important because when the rubber hits the road, when there's a crisis, we need to be able to work with each individual country on a menu-based approach. That's what we're doing with COVID. That's what we will be doing with the vaccine program. The countries will be deciding, and we are facilitating that process in a variety of ways. And so what we did beginning in April of 2019 was realign the staff of the bank onto a country-oriented framework. And we also added a vice president, a second vice president for sub-Saharan Africa, which has, we've been able to put more staff closer to the client. And so what that's meant is very large staffing when emergencies hit. For example, when the Lebanon explosion occurred, we had as many as 200 bank staff and their dependents in Beirut. Some were hurt, but they were able to begin work within 24 hours on the damage assessments. So the World Bank became the core of the damage assessment for working with the United Nations, working with the IMF, but very quickly getting out a damage assessment that's helpful to the government or to the formation. We're working closely with Europe on the Lebanon situation. So I wanted to give you kind of a long answer. I'll try to be shorter in the other answers, but what I wanted to point out is the importance of the resources, but also I know we're going to talk about the debt situation facing the poorest countries and even the middle income countries as we go forward. So let me turn back to you, Bill, and I'll shorten up here as we go. Thanks.
Well, I think it's quite impressive what you've outlined, the changes you've made since you've taken on this role exactly a year ago. Not surprising to me, given your history and track record. But how would you characterize the effectiveness overall of the multilateral response and international coordination efforts, including the work that's being done by the G20?
People are trying to work together, so that's good. And I think, I also believe that institutions need to take independent actions, meaning to actually move forward. We can't spend the entire amount of time talking about what we're going to do, but we have to go ahead and begin doing it. So recall in March of this year, Kristalina and I proposed a moratorium debt relief for the poorest countries. It seems sensible given the severity of the crisis. And I was very pleased that the G20 then endorsed that, and the Paris Club has endorsed that, and we were able to move forward. I pushed very hard for the May 1 start date of the moratorium. It was important to help the countries preserve the cash flow so that they could devote more of it to the health crisis itself. So that was successful, though I have to say, as people have been reading about it, it's not nearly as successful as I had hoped. For two reasons. The commercial creditors decided they didn't want to participate. They wanted to continue draining resources from the poorest countries, and some of the official bilateral creditors haven't fully participated. Notably, China hasn't been a full participant, and so these have meant that the benefit from the debt reduction, from the debt relief process that was originally envisioned hasn't been as full as it should be. I'm pleased today the G20 is endorsing an extension of the moratorium, and also they've made some improvements in the term sheet. Bill, you're an expert in one of the world's biggest experts in actual debt restructurings and debt reduction efforts. And they're driven by these term sheets where people talk about what they're going to do and they share information. That's been happening, but the premise, I've been concerned that the premise of the term sheet, both the one done in April by the G20, the work that the IMF has tried to do in order to try to get commercial creditors, it hasn't been as effective as was needed. So there's a couple of strengthening points in the term sheet that the G20 is completing today, but I think much more needs to be done. We can come back to that, but the ultimate objective, I think, of everyone in common is to have countries do well. The people in the poorest countries and in the middle income developing countries do better next year than they are this year. I don't think we're at that point, and I think more work needs to be done in order to come up with an effective debt reduction process. That gets us right into, we can talk about the Latin debt crisis of the 1980s and why did it take so very long in order to actually begin to reduce the debt of the Latin countries.
One question that I'd like to get to, since you already brought it up, is the extension of 6 months for the poorer countries by the G20. Some people think that that is not enough and it actually should have been extended a full year. What are your thoughts on that, David?
I had proposed a full year extension, but I'm frankly of mixed views.
I'm not sure I understand.
Okay, let me give background. I heard a question on the line of I'm not sure I understand. So the moratorium that was agreed to by the G20 in April, which took effect on May 1, only extended through December 31. So it was, I guess that's 8 months or 7 months of debt relief for the countries, 6, 7, 8 months. It has worked okay. Some countries, a little over 40 countries are participating and saving money, meaning they've been able to defer their payments to creditors, but quite a few creditors aren't participating. So that's reduced the effectiveness of it. But what happened today, the G20 extended by 6 months, meaning through June 30th of 2021, the moratorium. So that means official bilateral creditors, such as the Exim Bank of the US, the China Exim Bank, and other bilateral official creditors are allowing the countries to defer their payments. But people shouldn't take note that deferral means just that the countries would still be on the hook to make the full payment plus interest at the end of the deferral period. And so that's why I say I'm of mixed minds. I think we need to find a way to get beyond DSSI, the debt suspension initiative, and get to actual reduction in the stock of debt for the poorest countries. That's going to be very important in order for them to attract new investment, because otherwise the debt overhang is too burdensome for them to move forward.
Also, I think, David, you and I have discussed quite a bit the role of China. I mentioned it in my introductory remarks. And one of the things that is bothering people is that China is just an observer at the Paris Club, which is the official debtor creditor country forum. And it's not clear whether they are preparing to really join that. And that brings up the whole question of transparency, because the Kiel Institute in Germany estimates that One Belt, One Road alone has lent out something like $520, $530 billion, and the terms are very obscure. So I'd like to get your thoughts on what you think China ought to be doing, because we called for China to be a stakeholder. You know, we've been calling them to be a stakeholder as the world's second largest economy for some time. The difference here is that 10 years ago, they weren't a major creditor country. Now they are a major one. And I know you have specific thoughts in this regard.
Yeah, you know, the world has been trying to get China to join the Paris Club for years and years, 5 or 10 years. And China has been pretty clear that if it has the name Paris on it, they won't be a member because it implies that they're a rich country. The Paris Club, for those that aren't familiar, is this very old. It started maybe in the 70s or by the time I was at the Treasury Department in 1986, the Paris Club was a major institution where the world's official bilateral creditors, that's the export credit agencies, for example, were all members. And it was a very important part of the debt restructurings that were done for Brazil, Mexico, Venezuela, and Argentina in those years. So I was the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Developing Nations at Treasury during that period. And so as we fast forward to today, the Paris Club still exists, but of all of the official bilateral creditors, which includes the US, Germany, Japan, the UK, and so on, all of the majors, China makes up 65% of the total amount of debt of all of those, meaning it's 2/3 of the entire world in terms of that form of credit. And yet, they aren't a member of the Paris Club, so they don't do the reschedulings. They aren't part of the memorandum, the MOUs that are done. And so to push forward with that point, over the last week, there have been countless hours, meaning hundreds of hours by senior officials around the world of negotiation on the communique of the G20. And one of the key points has been that China doesn't really want to participate in this process because, in part, because they have 2/3 of the debt that is in question in this process. It's very important for the health of the poorest countries that they have some relief from the payment schedule that they're facing. But as we look at individual countries, for example, Angola has been in the process of a debt rescheduling in which the Paris Club creditors all agreed to an MOU. Now, the Paris Club keeps it secret. Here I'm pushing transparency and openness, but the Paris Club itself won't release the MOU, which seems odd, but that's been their tradition and their history. But more challenging then, China is not participating in the rescheduling of the debt of Angola to a full extent. And to put that in perspective, they continue to take very large interest payments from Angola at a time when the moratorium is supposed to be in effect. They've offered, and I think it's kind of a secret discussion that they have, but they've offered to delay the principal repayments by Angola, which are huge, to China. Bill, I don't want to bore the audience, but it's important that people hear the term net present value. So if I could describe it to people, net present value is a way to calculate the time value of money. So if you owe me $1 billion, or for some of these countries, $3 billion, and I say that you don't have to pay this year, you can pay me next year, you can see that that's worth some amount of money to the country. But with interest rates as low as they are right now, that's not actually worth very much, because if I have to pay you $3 billion next year, that means that no one else really wants to invest in me, because I'm going to be paying you, and the money is real, the dollar is real, and the burden of it is very real. There's no inflating your way out of debt nowadays. And so the reason I go into that, it's at the core. For example, over the last week, intense negotiations in the G20 working groups over the terminology of the net present value calculation that would be done in providing relief to these countries. And the reason that's so important and so I think mixed up, it's not, that process is not working well at all because it doesn't recognize the lowness of interest rates that we are now, that now benefits the world, but it also means that the burden of the debt on the poorest people of the world will be there almost permanently. So 5 years from now, 10 years from now, if they owe $3 billion today, they're going to owe $3 billion 5 years from now. And that's just too heavy a burden to give them light at the end of the tunnel. So I've been arguing very strongly that we need to reduce the stock of debt, that you can play the numbers game and say, well, you're giving some benefit by delay. It's extend and pretend. So you extend the term of the loan and you pretend you've done a favor to the debtor. And that is the core of what was approved, what's going on today. So we're kind of having an argument in the media today about what the G20 wants to call a common framework for the treatment of debt, which is very, very different from a common framework for the reduction of debt, which is what I'm advocating. So the world is a little bit stuck, and I think it would be good for the Bretton Woods Committee to think about this. I was in Nick Brady's office in Treasury when the idea was hatched. Actually, the framework was developed that would reduce the amount of debt of Latin America. It was the breakthrough in the Latin debt crisis in 1989, and then it was presented to the Bretton Woods Committee as the launch spot for the Brady Plan and the Latin debt reduction in early 1990. And so in the same way, I think the Bretton Woods Committee could think of it. We are in need of a rapid rethinking of the debt reduction scenarios that are available to the world. We're talking about a different set of countries. The poorest countries of the world have this giant amount of debt. The World Bank just released statistics early this week on the size of the debt. It's jaw-dropping in terms of the hundreds of billions of dollars that are owed that simply aren't payable. So the sooner that the international system can get its arms around this idea and begin to set up tools to reduce it, the sooner that we can get started on a resilient recovery, a greener recovery. Everyone talks about a greener recovery, which is what we want, that's resilient and durable. But right now, there's not a technique to get there because the size of the debt is so daunting.
Well, as you know, I'm very familiar with that because I was the one Nick Brady asked to gather the commercial banks and creditors together to help implement the Brady Plan. And so this is something that we are planning to take up, just so you know, in a special group at Bretton Woods, as you asked. Final question, because we're running out of time, but the whole area of corruption, given all these flows going to the emerging markets for COVID-19 and other programs are raising concerns. And you and I have discussed this before, and this is something that Jim Wolfenson concentrated on. So if you could just say a few words about that before we close out and take questions.
The World Bank has what's called the governance practice, which includes some corruption standards, but it's a difficult topic because many of the governments in the weakest countries have become presidents for life, and so it's very hard to work with the countries where it's relatively common practice. So what the World Bank does is we have high standards. The IFC, the International Finance Corporation, has high standards with regard to who we can work with, and the sharing of information on whether the money is going to the intended purpose. But money is fungible. It becomes very difficult. For example, and I face this problem every day. If we support a social safety net in a country, and that causes or allows the government of the country to divert resources that otherwise would be going into that social safety net, to divert the resources into some other purpose, meaning a pet project of the leadership, for example. Do you want to do that? Is it helpful to the country to put money in if you know that many of the resources are being wasted? That's one reason we wanted to do the direct COVID response, which was specific. We set up a menu of options. Bill remembers that term from the 1980s. So I wanted to do it. That was the idea, that different creditors would want to use different techniques for debt reduction. Okay, great. So what we wanted to do with our COVID response in April was to have the countries have a menu of what they might want to buy in order to fight COVID, because some countries wanted ventilators, some wanted oxygen, some wanted masks, some wanted personal protective equipment for doctors and nurses. And so we set up explicitly at the beginning a menu of options for countries, and that facilitated, that helped us do it fast. So one of the things I really want to push right now is we need a process of debt reduction for the countries urgently. And so that means I don't think if we wait a year, we're going to see a lot of disorganized defaults. Even Zambia today, I don't know if you saw, was missing a very important Eurobond payment. So we'll see more of that disorganized, disorderly defaults, which is very costly to the people of the country and really to the world community. So we've got to work fast now to avoid that. And I'm afraid the G20 efforts are not really going far enough at all, because they've been dominated by creditors. The G20 is a creditors group that don't really at the core want to do this debt reduction process. So I'm a bit frustrated.
I can imagine. Well, you've given us a tour de force, but I know there are questions. And so Emily, I will turn it over to you to manage the question and answer period.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, President Malpass, and thank you, Bill. We do have a couple of questions here, so maybe we'll continue on with the 1980s theme. And one of our members, William Janis, asks, are debt equity swaps similar to those used in the 1980s debt crisis feasible today, or would there be pushback?
Good question. We should examine that. That's an idea. But frankly, the countries that I'm working on most now, you know, the DSSI, that's the debt suspension initiative, is the 75 poorest countries. And if you look for equity in those countries, there's going to be it's a more limited universe than what was available in the Latin debt crisis. It's not as common to have equity instruments available that could be used. But definitely, I think we should be looking along the lines of flexibility in how we work through this debt problem.
Bill Rhodes, anything to add on to that?
No, what I'd like to do is to give as much time, Emily, for questions to David, because as I mentioned, we are going to take this up as one of our first projects. And we will be working with you and your staff on this, David, as to what we can do on this whole debt situation, including how you reduce the stock of debt. So, Emily, other questions?
Emily, can I ask myself a question, then follow on to what Bill said? Bill knows this well, but for people's, you know, there's a relationship between creditors and debtors, and the creditors right now hold even more cards than they did in the 1980s. In the 1980s, there was a struggle, and Bill was in the middle of trying to put together groups of creditors to work with debtors. But nowadays, because the Eurobond market is so much more powerful, and it's a diffuse ownership of the debt instruments, and then also because China is such a major force, which was not the case in the 1980s, then it becomes there's an imbalance, in my view, that is in favor of the creditors. They have a huge amount of the power through the IIF, through the G20, and so the debtor countries are getting left behind in this effort. And so that's why I hope that Bretton Woods could maybe think about the statutory changes that might be helpful in order to rebalance the relationship between creditors and debtors. Emily,
Well,
sorry.
we certainly will look at that. And of course, with the Brady plan, we securitize the debt. And this is a fallout of securitizing the debt. You can't get a few people around the table. When you were, with Nick Brady, and we were all working together on that. So it's a challenge for us. And Emily, I know, is smiling because these are things we plan to get into and working with you. Other questions, Emily?
Yeah, no, I thank you, President Malpass, for asking that question. That was one of our questions, and building on that sort of imbalance between the creditor and debtor relationship. A lot of people think, the CACs are kind of the panacea to that. What are your views on that?
I think they have helped. And over the last decade or 20 years, really, there's been a lot of research and thought done by the IMF, by the World Bank. My chief economist at the World Bank is Carmen Reinhart, who's a leading expert in thinking about what kind of debt contract is fair to the debtor and creditor. If we take the Ecuador example, they're going through a debt restructuring right now, and I'm worried that for the people of Ecuador, it won't be enough. It feels a little bit like the Latin debt crisis of the 80s, where there were repeated reschedulings, and while that was going on, it doesn't allow for enough new investment. Now, Ecuador has some strong directions and a lot of support from the IMF and the World Bank, and so we may be able to plow through that. But it raises the question of, are the bond contracts having too much power in those relationships? One of the things then, this is where you get lawyers involved, and some of them will work for free. They're very well, it's a very important part of law to try to figure out whether the covenants. One of the things I've thought is, as countries roll over their contracts, the world should be putting its foot down and saying that the covenant should be lighter when they are rolled over. So as China provides a rollover, which they've done in the last month or so in Ecuador, that the new contract should be less burden, should have covenants, legal covenants that allow and foresee the interests of the debtor. They did one thing positive, and we pushed hard for this. They in that process, Ecuador and China agreed to release the previous contracts, not the current one, but the previous ones, which are under a heavy non-disclosure agreement, an NDA that had been blocking anyone from reading those contracts. And the new contract has a shorter NDA. Rather than being a permanent non-disclosure, it's got a 1-year non-disclosure. So a year from now, we will finally be able to read the current contracts that exist between Ecuador and China, which will help people understand the true debt burden of Ecuador and see whether it's sustainable.
I'd like to take this opportunity, David, and Emily would be upset if I didn't, to say that we are desperately trying to get Carmen Reinhart to do a session with us. So I hope you will facilitate that, because she could be very helpful to us, and I know our audience would very much like to hear her. Just second of all, on Ecuador, which I follow very closely, because you have a first-rate finance minister there, Richard Martinez, is that as I view the restructuring, what I saw from China, which is maybe the major creditor nation there, they only rolled over their exposure for some 15 months, which is not going to help in the long run. So I think this is one of the challenges we face in this regard, and why it's necessary to get China into this process going forward.
And if you apply a very high discount rate to the deferral, so they deferred the payment on some of their contracts, and then if you apply a high discount rate, you can have the feeling that you've provided relief. But the reality is that amount will come due in 15 months and will feel just as heavy a year from now, because the long-term bond yields in both the US and in China are very low. It's going to be a very burdensome debt at the end of that period. That raises one issue. As transparency penetrates, then what lenders and borrowers are adept at doing is finding more complicated ways to avoid the transparency. So one of those techniques is the central bank swaps and also central bank deposits. So if I'm a central bank and I deposit money in your central bank, which then makes it available within your country, typically that was not counted as debt, even though I was able to demand, it was a demand note. This is the case of Pakistan, the case of Mongolia, and so on. And so what we've done in our most recent debt statistics is take note of those relationships and count it as part of the debt of the country. That way you can get a fuller picture and find out how to help the country become more sustainable in its debt. But typically those were, let's say, short-term contracts that rolled over repeatedly. So each time they roll over, it gives great deal of leverage to the creditor to demand concessions from the debtor at the time of the rollover. So those short-term contracts are challenging for the people of the debtor country because they come due, the bill comes due every 15 months in this case.
Emily, how are we doing on time? And do we have any time for additional questions before I sum up?
Yeah, let's wrap up with one final question, and I'm going to move away from debt for a moment. President Malpass, you mentioned the vaccine announcement that was approved just yesterday by the board. We don't have a global vaccine yet. Why is this announcement so important at this point in time?
Yeah. That's right, and maybe it won't be. If no one is able to invent a vaccine, then it won't be as important as it felt yesterday. But I was very happy to get the approval from the board, because then all of the paperwork can start. That's important. We're going to be able to use the same paperwork that we did from April and May, and that means a rapid availability of not only vaccines but also of treatments if those become available. So that part of it is important. And even tomorrow, people at the World Bank can start working with the countries. They're already doing a catalog or an inventory of the vaccination programs and needs in the countries. So, for example, those countries that have had bad experiences in the past with vaccinations, maybe you can build some public support for the idea that vaccination is a scientific concept that can be built on. That would be one. But more importantly, it's the distribution techniques through the hospital systems and the doctors. Those need to be prepared. Those will take months to prepare. And so we needed the approval and sizable sums of money in order to begin that process of preparing for treatments for COVID once those become available.
I think that we've had a tremendous discussion, David. Do you have any final words you'd like to leave us with? Certainly, you've incentivized us to move ahead on this whole question of sovereign risk, working with your staff very closely in all of the areas that you've mentioned. But do you have any final comments that you would like to make on any of the things that you discussed with us?
Well, I appreciate the relationship with the Bretton Woods Committee. One thing that we face is explaining ourselves. There's not a lot of global knowledge about what the World Bank does, and there's often misinformation about what is actually going on in country programs. Sometimes the countries themselves claim a different outcome from a program. So I think it's important that we keep the communication going. That includes on climate issues, for example, debt issues. And one thing that I hope Bretton Woods Committee will hold to heart is the goodwill of the World Bank and of myself, but of the World Bank and all of the staff in terms of wanting good country outcomes. and dealing in a very transparent way with our clients and with our shareholders, you know, the countries and the taxpayers that are putting in money. We want to be the most transparent and the highest quality development organization in the world. Thanks.
Well, we're here to support you in all of these efforts. And I think the World Bank and all of us in the world today are very lucky to have someone with your experience, your drive, and your motivation to get on with all of these subjects in the most difficult period we faced in over 100 years in this world. So thank you very, very much again. And we, as I said again, we're here to support you. We want to work very closely with you and your staff. Emily?
Yeah, I'll just echo Bill's comments here. You know, the Bretton Woods Committee will continue its historic role in partnering with the World Bank and figuring out this debt problem and supporting the IDA supplemental and in building public support for your institution. That's what we've historically done, and that's what we'll continue to do. So thank you very much.
I'm going to talk with Carmen. She's great, and we talked last night late because she was in the G20 communique drafting sessions, which were endless over the last week. And she'll be a great contact point to help you think about your role in debt. So thank you, everybody. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you.
And thank you for all you're doing.
Bye, all. Thanks.
Thanks for your time. Bye-bye.
Bye.